President Biden has agreed to provide Ukraine with advanced rockets that can strike at long-range Russian targets as part of a $700 million weapons package expected to be announced later today. Senior administration officials told Reuters that the rocket systems can accurately hit targets 50 miles away. The officials also stated that Ukraine gave assurances that they would not use the missiles to strike inside Russian territories.
In a New York Times op-ed Biden published yesterday, Biden justified the new weapons package, saying that while Russia's invasion would end through diplomacy, the U.S. must provide weapons and ammo to give Ukraine leverage at the negotiating table. Meanwhile, our next guest, Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, writes that if Ukrainians want to drive Russia from its soil, Zelensky will have to create an almost entirely new offensive force. Senior fellow and military expert at Defense Priorities, Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, joins us to expand on these ideas and weigh in on Biden's new weapons package. Welcome back. So explain, what do you mean by this new offensive force?
Yeah, right now you have the entirety of the Ukraine armed forces deployed in three fronts. There's one in the Donbas, there's one in the Kharkiv, and then there's one in the south near the Kherson region. So 100% of their troops are deployed in a drastic and desperate fight to keep Russia from advancing further into the country. In order to form an offensive force, you're going to need somewhere around 100,000 Ukrainian troops armed with the best equipment that there is really in the world, and certainly from NATO countries. And you can't just you can't just throw that on top of these guys who are trying desperately to defend. You've got to pull about 100,000 people who are right now not even in the military off to some far corner of the country where it's relatively safe, and then train them up at every level with this new equipment, which right now hasn't even been talked about, much less provided by the West. And only then can you realistically hope to drive Russia out. And so far, none of that's even been talked about. But until it has, any talk about driving Russia out is really just unsubstantiated.
So America is providing Ukraine with long-range missiles. They are giving assurances that although they can hit Russia, that they are not going to be used on Russian territories. Am I wrong to think that this is analogous to what happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis, where America objected quite heartily to the idea of long-range missiles being so close to our shores? And why should Russia feel any differently about this?
Well, there certainly is going to be viewed as analogous from the Russian point of view. I can assure you of that. Although there is a difference, to be fair, that these are not nuclear tipped missiles. But I'll tell you, what's important is what's going to come out of the White House later today, because more important than what they have announced is what they haven't announced. And that is, how many of these weapon systems are we talking about? How many rockets are we talking about? Because so far, they keep using the term a small number. And even though these are definitely advanced weapon systems, if you don't have a lot of them and a lot of rockets, they're just not going to make any difference on the strategic battlefield. They might make a difference in one spot on a certain battle, but only a little bit, not enough to tip the balance in any way. Even more important, who's going to operate these things? Now, my very first job in the Army back in 1985 was as an MLRS crewman, which is the same platform that's being talked about here with these HIMARS. And that training takes about 5 weeks after you've started your basic combat training. And, so the idea that these are going to go in fast is going to be, it's just not going to be realistic, because unless they're talking about sending trained American troops to operate these things, and I pray to God they're not, then you're going to take, over a month to have to train Ukraine people on how to do this. And I assure you, it's not easy training. So we need to have a sober idea that these things aren't coming in anytime soon.
So with what has changed? I mean, we've been hearing since the beginning of this war that Russia's not doing well, that any minute they're going to collapse. They're running out of supplies, and they're basically just being clobbered by the Ukrainians, and they're going to go home. Now it seems like there's been a drastic shift in the rhetoric about this, and it now sounds like, well, Ukraine is the desperate one, and Russia's actually making advances. What has changed? Has Russia amped up? Have they gotten better? Have they amped up? What is different now?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, the main thing that's different is that the Western media, especially the major media like Washington Post and New York Times, is now starting to cover what's actually happening. instead of what they wish were happening. And lots of people were making these sweeping judgments on what happened because of the initial phase where Russia made, just as I've said on your network many times, just catastrophic mistakes at both this strategic and at the tactical levels with how they operated this. And I won't go through all that again, but they definitely made huge mistakes. But they recognized it pretty quickly within just a matter of weeks, and then they completely changed it. And then they started focusing their combat power on one key part of the battle, of the war, in the Donbas. If they take that, then the whole of the war could change dramatic points. And Russia recognizes this. They've been making this progress substantially, but up to this point, the Western media keeps talking about like they're all a bunch of failures. But when you look at what's actually been happening for weeks now, not just recently, Russia is making methodical and critical progress. And if they continue on much longer, they're going to potentially unseat the entire Donbas fight and possibly take the whole thing. And then we're talking like 30 to 40,000 Ukrainian soldiers that could be either captured, destroyed, or cut off. And no one's talking much about that, but that's potentially key to the entire progress of the war from here forward.
Well, you made the point that not only is this of limited strategic value, in part because it will take 5 weeks or so for them to be, these rockets to be properly staffed. There's obviously the optical battle that's going on here, where it seems that this is an intentional provocation. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov says the U.S. was, quote, directly and intentionally adding fuel to the fire with its weapons delivery to Ukraine. The perception being that from Russia, the fact that this is not going to meaningfully help Ukrainians, at least in the short term. What is the calculus, you think, coming from the Biden administration in sending these rockets at this time?
Well, the most scary interpretation is that they're not giving a lot of strategic thought to this. They're hearing Zelensky continue to ask for these heavy weapons, and then finally they said, okay, look, we'll give you some. But it's not enough to make a difference, but it is enough to make them think that they can keep fighting. And look, here's where the metal meets metal reality. Forget about what Russia says or what's important to them. Look at what's important to the U.S. national interest and really even the Ukrainian side. If you believe you can keep fighting and winning, but the realities on the ground say that you can't, all you're going to do is increase your casualties, lose even more terrain, and possibly get a lot more people killed and cities lost than if you make a deal the best you can right now, as opposed to later when you'll have a much less positive outcome. And I fear that that's the real result of this, is not that it's going to help Ukraine win, but it's just going to increase the cost of their loss.
Well, and that's what I wanted to ask you about, your idea of a new offensive. Are you advocating for that and saying, let's do this so that we can drive Russia out of the country? Or are you saying, no, guys, make a deal? Should have made a deal a long time ago. And you keep losing territory. If you continue on like this, you will lose more territory. Make a deal. Which is it?
Yeah, as I was very clear in both the introduction as well as all three parts, I am absolutely and continuing to say, a deal. Let's get this thing done and do what's best for your country. And to point out that if, however, you decide you want to do the offensive, that you want to continue to try to drive them out despite anything else, this is what it's going to take, and this is what it's going to cost. And when I can show you that it's going to be a minimum of a year and probably more like a year and a half before you could have the capacity to do this, then that leads to the conclusion that the most rational thing to do is to make a deal.
Well, thank you, Lieutenant Colonel. We always appreciate your insights.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
We'll have more Rising after this.